So we're glad that everyone's here. The recording's getting started. And Leslie, you want to say hi to the folks and get us started?
Sure. Happy midday, everybody. We're so happy to have you here. I want to introduce myself. My name is Leslie Lipton, and I'm an attorney in Georgia. I've been practicing for around 20 years, and I've worked with lots of young people, kind of in the ages that we're going to be talking about today, who many people have assumed don't have much of a future after school. And we think there's so many opportunities and options for people. And I'm also the executive director of the Georgia Coalition for Equity in Education. I will drop a link in about that organization, who is one of the co-sponsors of today, and welcome.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Leslie. I'm Dana Lloyd. I work for the Georgia Advocacy Office. I'm a program director there and help lead our supported decision-making project, which has really been a wonderful addition to the work that GAO does to support people with disabilities of all ages to have access to the good things in life. And so I'm really excited to be joined with Leslie today and share this presentation with you. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And our technical assistant, we're starting with my slides if you can switch them up for us. I think there's a hole in the troposphere today, y'all. The tech is just not cooperating at all. But give us just a second and we'll be right back on track. Thank you so much for your patience. Leslie's dropped the link to the Georgia Coalition for Equity in Education into the chat, so you can have that, and we'll be ready to go in just a minute.
Leslie, I don't have, Dana,
Okay.
I have 28 slides of Leslie's. Doesn't look
No
like
worries. No worries. Give me just a second. Let's see if we can get Zoom to cooperate. All right, can everyone see slides? Okay, so we are going to dive right in. What we're here to talk about today is really exactly what Leslie said, thinking about folks that often maybe have been discounted and thinking about what's coming for them in their future. And we want to ask you to think a little bit differently about that. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about supported decision making and the power of vision. And Leslie's going to wrap us up in a few, thinking about how to use the information that we've offered you today in the school setting. Maybe we're going to do that. And so, as I mentioned, I work for Georgia Advocacy Office, which is the independent, federally mandated protection and advocacy system for people with disabilities in Georgia. And we share this vision statement because it's really central to the work that we do, but especially to the work around supported decision making. But we envision a Georgia where all people have value, visibility, and voice, and where even the most difficult and long-lasting challenges are addressed by ordinary citizens acting voluntarily on behalf of each other, and where the perception of disability is replaced by the recognition of ability. And that's important because that's the highest form of protection and advocacy that we have, is being in relationship with each other, having that support of a community that will take up our needs as if they were their own. And that's what we're working for people in Georgia. We do that in a variety of ways, making sure that people are free from abuse and neglect, investigating those claims, making sure that people have access to services and supports, and that their rights are protected and ensured. So voting rights, housing, employment, and then supporting the self-advocacy of people with disabilities and their community members, providing information and referral. So as we get to thinking about this today, we start with this first quote, right? And the quote says, "All I know is that the first step is to create a vision." Because when you see the vision, the beautiful vision, that creates the want power. So I was meeting with a family who had come to ask me about what should happen next for their son with a disability. And they were really kind of torn between the legal options that were before them. Should we seek guardianship, as some people had suggested? What about power of attorney? Could we maybe set up a special needs trust and a stable account? What should we be doing? And I really kind of tried to ask them just a different question. I said, well, tell me about your son. Tell me about this young man. And they started talking about the things that he liked to be involved in and how he was working a little bit and, what things were important to him. And as they just were talking kind of on their own, the father said, we really see him as being a person who can, live on his own with some supports, and this job that he has could grow maybe into a better job, and he could have a family or maybe participate more in our family, and maybe guardianship is going to get in the way of that. And that's exactly what how we think of the power of vision. Is as this family began to think about the vision that they had for their son, and the vision that he had for themselves, they began to see some other options open up. But we know that this journey of parenthood for any of us is not an easy one. It's not simple. And I found this quote in a report from the National Council on Disability that really, really struck me. And it said that all parents have fears about whether their teenager will be ready for the responsibilities of adulthood when they turn 18. But it's only the parents of teenagers with disabilities who are regularly advised that they have the option of preventing that child from becoming legally an adult in the eyes of the world, right? So we have to sit in that for a minute. We, as parents, we're all worried about this transition. I think back to my own transition and my relationship with my mom. That time is really fraught. But what could help us think differently about that? And what gets in the way for kids with disabilities? So that's a question for you. You can drop your answers in the chat, but what are some of the assumptions about young folks with disabilities? And why are these parents regularly advised that they have the option of preventing their child from becoming legally adult? What's that about? Why does that happen? Anybody have any ideas? Someone said they're scared, right, of people signing contracts that aren't good for them. It's assumed that kids with disabilities never grow up. Someone, I'm a sibling, and I guess you're saying you think parents are scared, right? The assumption is they just can't succeed. People might think it's to protect them. Folks have low expectations, right? People feel like folks are gullible, protection from others who would take advantage of them. And yeah, sometimes parents just want to keep folks in a bubble, right? It's hard, and that's exactly right. But what if we begin to challenge some of those assumptions and think just a little bit differently, right? What if we begin to raise those expectations and think about people as being capable and competent to work with support and have friends and relationships that can be supportive to them? Find ways for people to be involved and embedded in their communities in ways that are life-giving and enhancing to them, where they're contributing and giving back. Thinking about, being embedded in a family, whether it's a family of their own, or in their larger family, being an aunt or uncle, or having really great cousin relationships. What happens if we begin to think about people, and what it would take, right? That's one of the central questions, I believe, of supported decision making, is that we ask the question a little bit differently. We begin to wonder, what would it look like, for this person to have access to those things? And one of the other ways, another question that we sometimes ask, is to think about that vision as a compass, right? As a way of pointing us in a direction, as a way of giving guidance, when we're not quite sure which way to go. So just like that family began to question if guardianship was going to help their son move towards their goals for him or away from their goals from him, that's exactly how using vision as a compass might work, right? You could simply ask that question. So if we work on building this big vision for people and raising our expectations, then we can use that vision to help us navigate, and ask these questions about how things might move us in one direction or another. The other thing that it's important to realize is that just as young folks are on this journey to becoming adults, parents, we're on a journey too. And it's important to remember that and think through what that might look like. So when this relationship starts out, right, we're handed this bundle of joy, excuse me, we are told that we are the decision makers. We are in charge of this child's life. That is the expectation, right? And as children grow, we begin to do little things that offer them choices and options, right? Maybe what to have for a snack or what activity to do in the afternoon. All of these things are beginning to set us both up, the young folks, the children at that point, and the adults, for this journey that we're on, where these roles are going to switch. And I think it's important for us as parents to hold on to that we're on this journey too. So this graphic was created after a conversation with a parent who said exactly that to me. She said, Dana, my whole life, I've been thinking about what I needed to do to empower my son to become his own decision maker. But I hadn't done any of the work to move off of that top step, and it's getting crowded at the top. And she literally kind of put her hands together like this and said that. And so that's a part of the journey, is that parents have to be thinking about what are the skills that we're offering and the opportunities that we're offering, that as these young adults are growing and maturing, that we begin to move into more of this consultant and advisor role. And that's an important part of the shift as well, right? So young adults need opportunities to learn decision-making skills. Decision-making is a skill. It is not a static thing. It's not on or off. It's not that people can or can't make decisions, that people have capacity or don't have capacity. This is a skill. And like most skills, people need opportunities to practice and fail. And we talk a lot about safe failing. What are the ways in which people can make some mistakes, and learn from them that aren't going to be catastrophic? So in the example of contracts, right? Is there a way, right? Are there opportunities for maybe people to sign up for something, say a class or a club, and maybe it costs a little bit of money, and then they hit a point where they're not really interested in doing it anymore, but they've made a commitment to this, right? And that's a way that we can practice that safe failing when it comes to something like a contract, and helping people understand the commitment and the cost and those sorts of things. Another example would be just basic money management, right? Can folks have an allowance, and have an opportunity to spend money maybe unwisely, in some areas, or make choices about another activity that they might participate in and have a chance for those consequences to play out with support for people to be helping them learn through that process. Kids with disabilities may need different or more support, but it's about working through the accommodations to teach decision-making skills, which is really important. Again, parents are working on transitioning into that consultant role. And that we need just as much practice of thinking about what those accommodations are, and teaching those skills. That might not be something that you've really been thinking about, is teaching the skill of decision making. But working on that, your practice too creates opportunities to grow. And when this is challenging for both the young adults and the parent, that vision that you are working to develop for your child and that your child is developing for themselves, right, can become an anchor during that time, right? And so when we're trying to navigate this and it gets rocky, because it does, we can go back to the vision that we've set up. We can go back to the vision that we thought of and what we imagine for these young adults and what they're telling us about what they imagine for themselves, to become the thing that we hold on to, and then begin to think about, okay, well, how do we make decisions and how do we learn the things we need that move us closer to that goal rather than away from it. And in all of this, we're working on changing our mindset, right? And so as young adults are moving into that role of decision maker, parents, we know that we will always be there to help provide support and guidance and ask questions. But it's important to know that no matter what that support looks like, it will take a shift in mindset. And your vision of your role as parent is just as important in this shift and this transition as is the vision of who your young person is transitioning into. And so we've talked about this a little bit, right? That we're asking a different question, that oftentimes the question historically has kind of been, does a person need a guardian or do they not need a guardian? Does a person have capacity to make decisions? Is a person capable or competent? But we want to ask a question, we want to ask a different question, right? What is the vision regarding decision making? What do you imagine is possible for this young adult with high expectations? What would it look like for this person to have more choice and control and autonomy in their life? And what support are they going to need to achieve that? Those questions get us to different answers than just an either or question of, is a person able to make a decision or not, right? And so this is one of my favorite examples, is that if we were all together in a room and I said, hey, I'm gonna bring out dessert later, would you like chocolate ice cream or strawberry ice cream? And I ask you to raise your hands, most of you are gonna choose an option and you're gonna choose strawberry or chocolate. But if I ask you what's your favorite flavor of ice cream, right? Asking that different question is gonna get us a very different set of answers. And so we need to think about that when we're providing support to people, that we should move away from those either or questions, and ask more open-ended, what would it take? What would it look like? How might we do that? What in this moment, how do we get closer to our vision, right? Because those questions are going to be much more instructive than just a simple either or question. So we're going to take just a minute to kind of introduce supported decision making as a concept, and run through this. Are there any questions so far in the chat? Okay, so
No, but there's a great picture.
a great picture. Okay, let's check out this picture. Yeah, so someone working, right, and seeming pretty excited about this job. So thanks, Crystal, for sharing that. I definitely appreciate it. So when we're thinking about supported decision making, I think there's some essential factors, right? Supported decision making ensures that the person with a disability makes their own decision. It's not shared decision making. It's not democracy. It's not groupthink, right? This is about centering the person with a disability as the director and driver of their life and asking, what support can we put in place so that you are leading your life. It's a combination of relationships, practices, arrangements, all sorts of things that are designed so that people are able to make those decisions about their life, communicate those decisions to others. And it can be used in the context of guardianship, right? In the context of guardianship, meaning to avoid guardianship. So if there's a question of whether or not this person needs a guardian and that's gone before court, having a supported decision-making plan or process in place that shows how this person gets support to make the decisions that they need, it can be used to guard against that. In the context of guardianship, if guardianship has already been established, but maybe the circumstances have changed, you're thinking differently about this person, you have new information than you had when the guardianship was originally established. Your vision has shifted for this person or for yourself. Well, we can use supported decision making to think about growing the choice and control that this person has within guardianship, learning decision-making skills within guardianship, and also possibly a path to termination of guardianship. There's a great story that I'll drop in the chat a little bit later, a link about a young man who did exactly that, use supported decision-making to overturn his guardianship. So there's lots of options and ways that we can think about supported decision-making. Gonna make sure those go away again. So when we think about decision-making options, there's a lot of options available, right? The first thing I like to point out to people is that supported decision-making is not on the pyramid. What's on the pyramid is a person making their own decisions. And that's because supported decision-making is an accommodation for people being able to do that, right? For people being able to make decisions on their own. Just like a ramp helps us get into the door for work or school, or glasses help us see, supported decision-making is that accommodation. And when we think about the options that are available, we can think about more and less restrictive options. Things that are less restrictive would be like powers of attorney and advance directive. And they're less restrictive because the person with a disability decides to share their decision-making power with someone else, sets up or identifies times in their life where their decision-making might be challenged, where maybe they recognize they don't have skills. So say in a financial setting, I know that I'm learning and this is not a skill that I've really developed fully yet. And I want to share my decision-making power with my mom or another supporter in the area of finances. I'm doing really good with managing my time and my education plan at school. I don't need a lot of support there, but I see that I'm challenged in my financial decisions or my medical decisions. But the person with a disability retains that that ability to share that decision-making power. And it's limited, right? It's either limited by the circumstance, finances, medical. It can be limited for a period of time over the next 2 years. And at any point, the person with a disability can revoke that sharing and say, I don't want to share this decision-making power anymore. I want to share it with someone new. So in a lot of ways, the person maintains a lot of control. And as we move into the more restrictive options, that doesn't happen, right? These things are often, so the medical proxy and guardianship, a person with a disability really doesn't have any choice in that matter. The medical proxy is a statute that says for anyone in Georgia, if you're incapacitated in, say, a medical event, who can make the decisions for you? And it lists them out in an order of preference. And you don't really get any say in that. And in guardianship, you can't file a petition for your own guardianship. You can't go down to the probate court and say, I'd really like guardianship for myself. Can someone help me do that? And so both those processes start by removing the person really from the process. And in some ways, they are less changeable. They're more kind of total. Yes, there can be limited guardianships. Yes, guardianship can be revoked, but that's not how it most often happens for people. That most often, even if a petition is for limited guardianship, it often ends in what we call a plenary or full guardianship. And so we just think that if we're starting with this vision of what a person's life is going to be like, and we're asking ourselves to really imagine and have high expectations, are there options we could start with right? Are there options that we could work on to enhance decision-making skills before we're considering these more restrictive alternatives? And I think the answer to that question is always yes. And one of the reasons that we want to consider the options that are available is because there can be unintended consequences. So this is another option for, or another opportunity for you to drop some things in the chat. So what are the explicit and intended consequences of guardianship? What is it that people are setting out to do? What becomes true legally? But also, what are some of the unintended consequences of guardianship? How might the thoughts and perceptions of the person under guardianship change, or the thoughts and perceptions of others? So what happens with guardianship? Both the intended consequences and the unintended consequences. Throw a couple things in the chat. Let's see what we can learn from each other. Leslie, you have any thoughts here? Yeah, so someone said, I think that a person under it might feel unempowered, right? But one of the maybe real consequences is that they can't actually enter a contract, right? That's a intended consequences. Yeah, the individual no longer feels like they're heard, right? Some of the unintended consequences. Yeah. What else? Any other ideas? Someone said they might be traumatized. That's exactly right. This can be a really traumatic process, right? There's a court hearing that people may not be aware of. People are required to be served, so there's interactions with law enforcement that can be very, very difficult for people. People might lose the right to choose where they live. Others get the idea that the individual is not able to make sound decisions in their life, right? We talk about that sometimes as like a blanket. So a person may really be challenged in one area of decision making, but they have a guardian, so people just kind of assume they can't make any decisions. I think that's one of the unintended consequences. And right, the person themselves might begin to feel like they're not capable of making good decisions, right? If I'm never consulted, if I'm never the person making the decision, then maybe I begin to think, I guess I'm just not a good decision maker. That's a great one, Satara. Satara said they are no longer looked at as a real person, and I think that's absolutely true, right? In the eyes of the law, these decisions that we make, where we go about our day and decide, are we going to go to the Publix on North Decatur? Are we going to go to the Publix in Avondale? As simple as that might sound, that is how we get to express our freedom. And when people don't have the options to make those types of choices, it really can impact other folks seeing them as a real person. I really appreciate that comment, Satara. So we agree with most of what you guys are saying, right? That despite whatever the intended consequences of guardianship are, the unintended consequences can be quite troubling. So this is a quote from Madeline L'Engle that says, because to take away a man's freedom of choice, even his freedom to make the wrong choice, is to manipulate him as though he were a puppet and not a person. And so this graphic, the illustration that's on your screen, was created by a young man named Derek Hurd, who works with us in our supported decision-making project. And when he heard this quote, he quickly created this graphic that said, I don't want to be like a puppet. So it's Derek there in yellow with scissors pointing towards a marionette string, a marionette puppet that looks kind of like him. And he's clear about that, right? I think we're all clear about that. No one wants to be a puppet in their own life. We all want the opportunity to go after the things that matter most to us. And that's because the goal, right, of our life, the life of people with disabilities, really is self-determination. And we have research that shows when folks have more access to self-determination, when folks have access to choices that matter, they're more independent, they're more integrated in their communities, they're more likely to have a paid job, they're physically healthier, and they're better able to recognize and resist abuse. And one of the quotes that I always share here from Dave Hensberger, who was doing some abuse training when I worked in a residential service provider, said, if people never have the opportunity to say no to peas for dinner, And what makes you think they're going to say no to anything else, right? And y'all hit on that in your comments, that people start to feel like maybe I can't make decisions. And that actually makes people less safe, right? If they feel like everybody else gets to decide for me, even for things that might actually be abusive, people are less likely to stand up against that. And we see, right? So we see what happens when people have more access, but we also see what happens when people are denied access to self-determination. So people do feel helpless and hopeless and experience low self-esteem, feelings of inadequacy and incompetency, things that you all mentioned. And we can see that these overbroad guardianships can sometimes have a negative impact on physical and mental health. And then this quote, again, the very bottom one from the National Council on Disability, says that young adults with disabilities are at particular risk, as guardianship may be an obstacle to the development of self-determination and the skills necessary for life after high school, right? So we might be getting in the way of people developing the skills. We might be getting in the way of people achieving that vision that we set out for them, and that they set out for themselves as they were moving towards adulthood. So this is a graphic that we use. The Georgia Supported Decision Making Project is called I Decide. And DECIDE is an acronym that really helps us think about the core components of supported decision making. So people are directing their lives. People are enlisting the folks that are going to help them make these decisions. They're making choices, the kind of component choices that go along with this. Folks have to learn to inform other people how this works for them. And I think the most important two letters, right, are determining and experiencing. So folks are setting the goals, folks are setting the vision and the course for their life, and they need experience and opportunities to gain that. So to compensate for a little bit of our technical difficulties, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second and move forward in the slides for a bit. But any questions or thoughts while I do that, and then we'll transition to Leslie in just a second.
Can we read you a question from the chat?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, this is a gray area. When you take away guardianship in some cases, the state will run away with doing what they want. And even though you technically are a guardian under the law, the state doesn't see it that way. Sometimes guardianship is to protect someone, not just to control them.
Yeah, I think that that's why we kind of asked that question about intended and unintended consequences, right? And that what I'd be hoping we're thinking about is how do we build the person's skills and the network of people around them, right, to kind of fend off and ward off from that encroaching that definitely can happen because I think when you're talking about kind of runaway state services or runaway others, right? It might be because they don't hold a high vision of that person. It might be because they're not engaged with that person in a way that is actually helpful. And so what I hope that supported decision making offers is a chance for that person themselves to kind of build their strengths and competencies, but also the folks around them. And then to use that vision to go back and really think about what what it is that matters most for folks, and how to accomplish that. So yeah, it is absolutely a gray area. There's nothing I'm going to tell you today that is a magic bullet or a silver shield, but it is about thinking differently, asking different questions, and I think that can be really, really helpful. Okay.
Do you see the other question? You want me to read it to you?
I'll take another question.
Okay, I'm reading it to help also with the recording. Given the age of majority is a little random, what do we do with kids who will be ready eventually, but not at 18? For the same reason a 13-year-old is an adult, my kid might not be there at 18. How do I handle this gap?
Absolutely. And I think, I tell folks all the time, supported decision making is not a good crisis planning tool, right? So the goal is that we're hoping to help build decision making skills over time. And I think we would think about all the ways in which, right, that first quote from the National Council on Disability, all the ways in which none of us were really ready at 18, right? Not really ready for all of it. I know I still had some learning to do. There were things I was ready for, and there were things I was absolutely unprepared for. And so it's about how do we build those skills? And I think that there are supports that can be in place, right, for that gap. So things like power of attorney, or maybe a stable account really does make sense for a while if that's where the person struggles. But I think it's about asking those questions. Where are the places? What is the concern? Where are the places that the person really excels, right? What do we know about their strengths that might be really helpful in us making a plan for the places where they might have some struggles? And so I think you're right. The age of majority can be kind of random, in that it's not set, kind of based on who a person is. But the process, I think, is about helping people get prepared and understanding that ready might not really be true for any of us, right? And I think there are lots of ways that we can try to support people to do that.
Another question, which I think is so good, is how does a guardian tackle medical providers who don't want to respect the guardianship? Which
Yeah,
is an
that's really
interesting point to safety. If you talk to people and they say, why are you getting a guardianship? They're like, I have medical powers. And people who have a guardianship are like, doctors
yeah,
aren't. I mean, it's an
yeah, that's
interesting
one of
point.
those.
The intended consequence, right?
Right. Absolutely, Leslie. Keep going there. I like where you're going.
I mean, the intended consequence of having a guardianship of every parent I've ever talked to is to have control over the medical decision making. But here we have somebody saying, I have a guardianship, so I'm involved in the medical decision making, and then the medical professionals don't respect the guardianship. So point being that the intended and unintended consequences of kind of both decisions have a lot, are not predictable always. Some are, but some aren't.
Not always predictable. That's exactly right. And I think going along with that, one of the things that I try to offer to people is to think about, well, then if it's not either or guardianship, right? If guardianship, you wanted to be involved in the medical decision making, you got guardianship, and we still didn't get to that consequence, well, then what could we do instead, right? And I think it's about helping build skills, right, for the person to be able to continue to participate in this process, and for the person themselves to have the support they need to say, no, Dr. So and so, this isn't really what I want, right? So I think that it is the skill and the support that can be counter to that, even when guardianship isn't working as intended. All right. Well, I
Okay,
think we're gonna let
one last one.
questions. All right, let's go for it.
I know I'm giving away my time because it's not my time. I want people on the Zoom to get what they need.
Yes.
So somebody said, I really love supported decision making, but I really wish for something like a limited guardianship. And then somebody else said, I think there's a movement to allow limited guardianship or sunsetting in Georgia. What's going on in Georgia? To talk about
Yeah, that's a
options.
great question. That's a great question. So I will say we don't have a ton of data on guardianship. So some of these statistics are kind of old and worn out. But the national statistic, the last time there was a kind of comprehensive study, is that of the petitions that are entered for guardianship, no matter what was requested, 96% of them end in full guardianship. So judges are not really excited about limited guardianship, right? They're not really thinking. They're kind of, the judges themselves are trying to be protective. Well, we don't want you to have to come back if things change, and let's just do it all in kind of one fell swoop. So yes, there is kind of a national movement to say we need better than that, right? And that there should be options. There's a lot of reform efforts around guardianship kind of sunsetting. So maybe a guardianship is entered, but it has to be reviewed on a really robust level in sometimes 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. In Georgia, the movement really is around thinking about the Georgia statute actually says that guardianship shouldn't be entered before less restrictive alternatives have been tried and shown to not be effective. And that's where a lot of the reform efforts in Georgia are right now. And so that when people are making petitions and when judges are reviewing those initial petitions for guardianship, they're questioning, have we offered other alternatives? Have we tried something else before we're moving in that direction? Because I understand the appeal of why people would look for limited guardianship. And I've had conversations with parents where I've said, some places in the world are doing really amazing, interesting things, like rewriting their civil code to do away with adult guardianship, period. The United States is not there. Georgia is not there. So if you're imagining what your limited guardianship would look like, can we build that with supported decision-making? Can we work on that? Can we help people enhance their skills and have opportunities to practice? And if you get to a point that it feels like that's not working and a person is more vulnerable because this is what we've done, guardianship will be there, right? The probate court will be there. But what if we start by asking a really different question and working to enhance people's skills and offer them the support that they need. But that is not to say that those two things can't happen somewhat simultaneously, right? That people can use supported decision-making in the context of a guardianship. But to Satara's point about people not being seen as people and some of those unintended consequences, we have to hold that. And I think it's important that we don't imagine that some of those negative consequences don't still flow even when we're working really hard to support people in the context of a guardianship. All right, Leslie, it's all you.
Thank you, Dana. I could listen to this forever. Okay. Okay, can y'all see the right thing?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm taking it from a different viewpoint. If Dana's saying, what's going on 18 plus, 25, 35, 55, I'm going to talk to you about what you want to see happening from, birth to 20 to 25 and what specifically can be happening in school that can support this big vision. And it's funny, we actually did this presentation maybe a month and a half ago, and I went first, then Dana came through. But I decided it might be even more interesting to start in the reverse. And part of what we have to remember is this really is about adolescence. One thing, when I was a kid, we thought the teenage years, the adolescent years were like over with around 18 or 19. And more recent brain research has come out that adolescence doesn't even end till 25. So part of it is we're thinking about parenting and supporting young people going through teenagers and adolescents. And so Dana and I, you'll both see a big focus on vision. Vision is a mental picture of what could be, fueled by a passion that it should be. And unfortunately, I'm going to say unfortunately, the burden oftentimes of the vision making is really totally held by the parents. Notice, I don't think people with disabilities are a burden at all, not that. But just the idea that so often the community and schools and other folks can have very low expectations, and parents have to really raise it up. And feel free to put in the chat your experiences of that. And so one thing we're looking at is life trajectory. Okay, so life's trajectory, this is really about where things get started and how they continue going. So if you have a young person, and I think there are varying roles of people on this call. So my guess is we have some professionals, I know we have parents. I think we have some siblings. So if you're thinking about somebody with a disability who starts and it's segregated early intervention, they're typically going to be moving down a very segregated life path. Oftentimes we call this a shadow system. It's not the top system that is kind of typical experience that many of us have, but it's a special system. And if you can't see me, you could see that I put air quotes around special because it doesn't necessarily have more of the good things than the top row. And you might have seen this. I've had people say to me, we have something really special and great for your kid. And once you start to dig into it, it's not necessarily better than what's going on for kids without disabilities. It might have a little more accommodations or modifications, but it doesn't actually mean it has more of the thing. For example, if you were looking at recreation sports and you looked at a recreational sports league for kids who do not have disabilities, they may play 3 to 5 hours a week. Sometimes when parents go to sign their kid up for soccer, a rec league, parents of kids with disabilities, people will say, we have something special for your kid, just for kids with disabilities. Say, how often is it? It's an hour and a half a week. It's a lot less. And then we wonder, and then once a kid ends up in that, typically kids with disabilities don't need less instruction or less opportunity to role modeling or less time on the field. They need more time. And so once you start on this segregated path, by the way, the same is true with academic instruction. There's oftentimes less academic instruction in segregated places. It pushes people to continue staying on this path. And I like going after Dana because we could definitely put most kids without disabilities have a version of supported decision making. Whereas kids with disabilities their families are totally immediately to go for guardianship really as part of this trajectory. I actually have a 17-year-old and there's a lot of focus on legally what happens. And he'll need a lot of support on making these decisions. And we'll be putting in a lot of safeguards. I'm not sure I've ever met an 18-year-old that's ready. By the way, I'm 47. I'm not sure I'm ready. I don't know why I'm allowed to sign contracts. That's a whole nother story. Okay. Any questions on this path, the typical pathways? Very important. And so one thing to think about, if you have a big vision, and many people do have a big vision for their kid about what's possible, is that you are able to create a vision statement. And I can, we now have some questions. I'll drop some links into making a vision statement. Vision is the destination, but the IEP is the roadmap. So an individual education program and plan can help you walk towards that vision, right? That's what we want it to be doing. So not boilerplate goals that every kid has in the same way, or a lot of kids have in the same way, but really focus on a vision of what life would look like after school. So let's talk about transition plans. And let me be very clear. I hate being recorded. Ask my colleagues, I'll tell you, I never let anybody record me except Dana, because I trust her. And I slightly hesitate to say this being recorded, but I'm going to say it. If you asked me my vision of the best thing that could happen for education, I would definitely not say fully funding and implementing IDEA. Like these transition plans, they're a little weird. Like, I don't think like it's the best way ever to do transition, but it is the legal way. So we'll be talking about it. But from like, when you think about a really normative pathway, a typical pathway, there isn't a transition plan in here. There's just a lot of exposure to a lot of different activities, and a lot of jobs that you like and jobs that you hated. And that really helped you kind of figure out which way to go, right? It wasn't like a plan. But we'll talk about the plan because that's what the law says. And I'm a lawyer and we're all here, okay? So transition plans, they can provide opportunity for integration, independence, choice, and self-determination. They can. Oftentimes they don't, but they can be written that way. And so for young people, you really can focus on skills for an independent and integrated life within this transition plan process. And there are an opportunity to move towards real integration. There's possibility here. So when must you start a formal transition plan within the IEP process? Either 16 years of age or ninth grade, whichever comes first. The plan must have specific transition services. But kids can receive transition services if the IEP team term decides that they're needed or appropriate. As we discussed earlier, most kids with disabilities need more exposure and more instruction to make these kinds of decisions, which I think it's pretty easy to argue, at least make the argument that kids who are younger than 16 could benefit from specific kinds of transition services. In the same sense, let kids be kids. I haven't met many 16 or 18-year-olds that know what they want to be when they grow up, whether they have disabilities or not. So, you have an option on how you want to do that. And so the goal of these transition services are to help students transition from school to post-work activities. There are a lot of different types of post-work activities, not just post-secondary education or not just a job. There are a lot of options. And so one thing to know is that these goals within the transition plan should be based on appropriate assessments. And those assessments should be focused on creating certain types of goals. So this isn't supposed to be teacher observation or just kind of very cloudy, kind of nebulous things, but there are actually a fair amount of career types of assessments. And this field's really growing. At the same sense, I want you to be aware that assessments aren't everything. And so I really, the person who wrote this particular post on social media is somebody who is autistic and is somebody who I've just learned so much from. So Amy says, here are some things IQ is not. It's not an intrinsic attribute. It's not a measure of capacity for agency, autonomy, or self-expression. IQ is not a reflection of whether someone's capable of learning. IQ is not a reflection of survival. IQ is not a measure of worth and not a requirement for human rights. What is your IQ? It's literally a score you get on an IQ test. And so when you think about how many times we see IQ used defensively to stop people's academic exploration, their sexual identity, their legal rights, their freedom to make all sorts of choices, it's pretty worrisome. It's not pretty worrisome, it's very worrisome. And so we have to be really very thoughtful about what that looks like. So my point to you as a lawyer is to use assessments when they're helpful to you and to not use them when they are not helpful to you. I'm still looking at the chat, by the way, if you've got questions, feel free to chime in. And so the goal for younger people with disabilities is the same goal we have for ourselves, is this little blue star, this overlap of what you love, what you're good at, what you can be paid for, and what the world needs. That's your purpose. And so in order to figure that out, we have to have a lot of life experience. And I believe, and I have seen my own vision, my own heart, I have seen this happen for many people with significant disabilities who a lot of people assumed were unemployable. This is totally doable. There's nobody I've ever met that I did not believe this could happen for. So one of the benefits of really sitting down with an IEP team and really working on these transition goals is some of the benefit of goal setting that benefits everybody. So this is not special goal setting. This actually, I pulled this from some internet research that was just about goal setting generally. That goal setting provides a focus and direction. It establishes accountability. It fosters personal growth. creates motivation and sparks inspiration. So you really might want to pull the IEP team back together again and just have conversations, like just have a meeting about the transition plan and the goals around the transition plan. And one of the things, and one of the reasons Dana and I are presenting this together is I think you should have a lot of goals around supported decision-making and going back to a lot of the skills that people need in order to be more likely to have the opportunities to have supported decision-making. And those things can be worked out from a very young age. And so we've already talked about this, and I'll make if you go to my Facebook page for Lipson Advocacy, I will definitely have these handouts available. So in Georgia, you can get special education services through the year of your 21st birthday. It depends on your county when that is. If it's your 21st birthday the day, or if it's the 21st year. And transition services are designed to help the student move from employment to the next step. And these activities are based on students' needs, preferences, and interests. One way I often see these kinds of transition plans go sideways is the kids really aren't interested in whatever opportunity the school has immediately available. So if the school has folding pizza boxes available, or cleaning up the cafeteria after lunch available, or some sort of other kind of very low expectations task that schools can have available, and students aren't interested in it, who gets blamed? The student gets blamed. Student's not very interested in it. When I promise you, if you gave me a lot of different types of jobs, I would fail at it. And then you'd say, Leslie Lipson is unemployable. But the truth of the matter is, when it's not relevant, most people are highly unmotivated, or it's not a good fit. So with transition services, the same idea. It's helpful for parents to have the discussion with their child for their desires for vocational, educational, independent living, and other goals. Point being that if it's not working, oftentimes it's because it's not personally meaningful or personally relevant to the student. I really love this cartoon and I use it all the time. We will be in a ship sinking at the bottom of the ocean, screaming that we've never done it that way. And so when you do bring up ideas to an IEP team or another type of team, and they said, we've never done it that way. Number one, you're on the right track. I give you a gold star for adulting and parenting. That's awesome. And number two, a lot of the ways we've been doing it has not been resulting in kids leaving school with a lot of the skills that we need and hope for the future. So keep on thinking about it in different ways. And you'll also know that you have a pretty well-developed vision when you can see how things should be. And it doesn't always look like this very kind of typical way in which we assign students with disabilities to go through transition. So I'm not going to run through these, but I will definitely give you the slides. But these are different types of services within a transition plan, and they're pretty big, pretty varied, right? Within the IEP, it needs to say who is the responsible agency that should be providing that service. Don't let the services just be listed. They say, hey, hold up, who's responsible for doing that? Hold up, stop the meeting for a minute. Who's going to be doing that? Service to provide a particular service to a student, it's not going to be done. That's not how it works. The school district is responsible for providing what's written in the IEP. Again, goals are based on vision. No goals without roles. One of the things that you'll find to be uber successful is for students to, within their IEP plans, that certain goals be to have a job, to get invited to, I'm sorry, not invited, but to have very specific roles within the school, to have a leadership role on student council, to have a particular job within a community service project, to have an internship. Like these would be roles, not activities. They're not things you do an hour to a week, but roles. And that gives kids, all kids, a lot of meaning and understanding of what work is like. Goals should also define who's responsible and build an accountability check. We have another mentor, another friend who calls a lot of these meetings an annual bureaucratic meeting. But we don't want transition planning to be an annual bureaucratic meeting. We want it to be really thoughtful and maybe meander a little bit, because typically this age of kids, their interests do meander. That's really typical. And then if things are off track, they're not working, meet again, get it back together, right? Okay, can everybody hear me? I see something in the comments that it was cutting out with goals.
Yeah, you're back now, Leslie.
Okay. So a goal without a plan is just a wish. Goals are not enough, right? We have to have goals, and we have to have implementation and accountability. So these are tips for preparing for adulthood that happen in school. If you start doing these now when your kid is young, or even whatever age your kid is, it will help with this entire process that Dana has laid out. So make sure your kid's opinion is heard, even if you have to interpret. There's so many ways to bring kids' opinions into IEPs or transition services or other ways. A piece of art, a video, a voice memo, having a student come and talk to the meeting, have them coming for 20 minutes of the meeting, a longer part of the meeting, have them do a structured interview with somebody and record it, have a transcription of that interview. I mean, I can go on and on and on of creative, possibly emotionally safe and interesting ways to bring forth kids' ideas into these kinds of planning meetings. And nobody, including us, should be making plans for our kids without their input. We need to get them really comfortable and used to the idea that they are steering the ship. So there are post-secondary programs, you should look into it. They're also available, like a lot of typical programs. When I say typical programs available to everybody in our community. Yoga and photography. There's adult literacy programs, right? People learn to read when they're 90. There's continuing education, to use assessment tools. One thing a lot of parents I've talked to as their kids are graduating is that people can be lonely and really miss, especially the friends they might have had at school. So to really focus on how do you continue your interaction after you leave school. A really good idea I heard from some friends was creating certain traditions around the year. You can continue those traditions. So if you always host a Thanksgiving get together, when some of your kids' friends are home from other places, then maybe you could still host the Thanksgiving get together. Also to make sure kids have what's really typical, which is a phone and social networking, because that's how most kids really keep up with their friends at that age. Volunteering in sports and rec programs, and other skills like safety, doing chores, learning about nutrition, money, understanding how to use Apple Pay on a phone. That would be something that's pretty typical nowadays. And maybe you also struggle getting your kid to do chores, because my kids really don't understand that they're doing chores because they live in the house, not for me. Anybody else? Okay. So who decides transition services? It's at an IEP meeting. Transition planning must be student and family driven. And students will become and participate as active self-advocates throughout the transition planning process. And hopefully you can see that participating in this process is a great foundation and great repetition for many of the decisions you'll need to make in the rest of your life. So whether we're thinking about supported decision-making or other types of processes as people become adults, this is the training ground. This is how to start this off well. So also within transition planning, students should be provided information about self-determination and self-advocacy training. That can be within a transition plan. Transition plans should include parents and respect them. And where does it come from? You mean what part of the law legally makes this happen? Where does this training come from? Who can provide the self-determination advocacy training? So I think most districts have teachers that can provide that kind of training. But also, I think that there are, I think the Center for Independent Living also provides that kind of training. Katie, you should also drop some links in. Katie runs an incredible project that also does self-advocacy and self-determination training, but really a leadership project for people that are a little older. Satara said you can put self-advocacy goals into the IEP. Absolutely. Katie dropped in a link for Uniting for Change. You should take a look at that. It's incredible. So we should be asking for that and asking for it to be done well. Providers will encourage students to utilize principles of self-determination advocacy. So kids shouldn't be retaliated against when they actually are advocating for themselves. Kids should be told though, like they should be pushing the boundaries. They should be pushing the envelope. One-way negotiation, you know you've asked for enough and eventually they say no, right? So this is about the transfer of educational rights under the age of 18. Much like some of the things Dana referred to, is even though a student becomes the person responsible for education decision-making at 18, a student can invite people to their IEP meetings like their parents at 18. And most students will. And parents still retain the right to notice as long as the student remains eligible under IDEA. So even though kids have the decision-making right, young people, parents still have notice, so you can know when an IEP meeting is and say to your kid, I see you have a meeting next week. You want me to come? So your children are not a masterpiece that you create. They are their own masterpieces, creating themselves, and you've been given the privilege of watching them be the artist. And this is something that all parents across the world have deeply in common. And sometimes when we watch them be the artist, we're like, what the hell are you painting? And sometimes we watch them be the artist, we are very proud. But that's something that there is no amount of transition services or guardianship or anything that can save us from that part of parenting. It is going to happen. This is a visual that we did this event in person a couple of weeks ago, and this is like a visual representation of that event that Gabby created. And this is my contact information that I can drop in. And actually, I'm going to try to drop these handouts into the chat right now. But we actually have a couple minutes left, and I think we could stop recording and have questions. Does that sound good?